I didn't move the rostrum, so I wasn't sure. Well, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. It's 9:30. We're a little slack this morning, but hopefully some more will be able to come in. We're going to look today at the seventh and final of the seven churches to whom Jesus spoke in the first century. And just very, very quickly, why do we spend, in this case, 2 months, looking at these 7 first century churches to whom Jesus spoke? Why take this time? What possible relevance could these churches with totally different ethnicity all the way around the world, 1900 plus years ago, what could that mean to us at Saginaw Church of Christ today?
We find the same values they
Yeah, it's a good point. There's not a single one of the 7 churches, there's something in it is not relevant to Saginaw. Not a one. Both the negatives and the positives. And I certainly believe that when we look at this 7th church, the church at Laodicea. In fact, in my humble estimation, Laodicea is more similar to 21st century churches in the United States than any of the other 6. It's very similar. Now let's talk a little bit about Laodicea before we begin today. And again, why do we spend time looking at the social, political, geographic features of these 7 churches? How does that help us understand what Jesus is saying to them?
It really helps me visualize the time, the location. I think it's been great.
Well, I hope it's been beneficial to each and every one of us. I know it certainly has to me. We look at this because, as we've talked about innumerable times, the political setting, the geographic setting, the economic setting, it has influence on each and every church, just like the socio-political geographic setting of this part of the world has the influence on Saginaw. And we really, as I've talked about many times, you can't understand what Jesus is saying, particularly the symbolism, if you don't understand this background that we're looking at. And I think you'll see that very, very prominently in our study today. Now, Jesus is speaking here again to the church at Laodicea. Laodicea, if you will visualize, that there was that Roman postal road, kind of like a horseshoe, that went all the way from the Aegean Sea and then back to the Aegean Sea. And Laodicea is on the far eastern part of this road, right down at the bottom, not too far from the Aegean Sea. Pardon me. Not a port city, but it's going to have, as we'll see in a moment, a very important geographic location. So this final church down on the end, the last of which Jesus spoke, if I were to use one word to describe Laodicea, it would be wealthy. In fact, Laodicea was one of the most prominent, omnipotent, blessed economic cities in the whole Roman Empire. And we're going to see why. Very, very wealthy. But we're also going to see that that has some negative influence on the church in Laodicea. Laodicea had a lot of blessings physically, materially. First place, in its location right there, as we've talked about, all the 7 churches depended a great deal, all the 7 cities in which these churches were located, depended on trade. None more so than Laodicea. Not only was it on that Roman postal road, but there was a major trade route that went from the Western Roman Empire all the way to the Eastern Roman Empire, and Laodicea sat right on that trade road. And so literally, they had trade from the west, Greece, the Italian peninsula, and from the east, Mesopotamia, the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, Asia. And so they had tremendous trade. And that trade led to a huge banking industry. Now, can you think just a moment, why would trade and banking, even primitive in our view today, why would that go hand in hand? Why would the banking be a big, big industry and also lead to a whole lot of wealth in Laodicea? Go ahead, Dan. Exactly. You've got money coming both directions. Money to buy things, but money they're selling things. And plus, there's a tremendous trade currency deal going on. Why would this currency trade be so huge? Exactly. You've got currency coming in from all over the world. And of course, these bankers would convert currency into what was accepted in Laodicea. Pardon me, I'm going to have one of these powerful cough drops. And I warn you, if your eyes start burning, these things are powerful. So I'm going to ask for your forgiveness when I put it on. This old West Texas boy is still not used to the humidity in this part of the world. And I think that and the cedar elm that's falling so drastically right now. Something's eating me up. So I'll try to take a step back so it won't be quite as stout on you. But this banking industry, not only was it profitable to the bankers, but it was profitable to everybody in Laodicea, which led to a whole lot of the wealth that was there. In addition, Laodicea also had what we might call a huge textile industry. What is that? Cloth. Yeah. And what precipitated this great rise in the Laodicea, where it was located there was tremendous availability of wool and mohair from back in the east, which a lot of those nomadic traders, of course, they raised sheep and goats, and they had a special process, particularly with the mohair, that was called black wool. And it was a very desirable product, and particularly for the wealthy people. And that gave rise to another industry, the dye industry. What color in particular was noted for the wealthy individual, and particularly for nobility and royalty? Purple. And they had a very, very distinct trade in this purple dye that was used throughout the Roman Empire, and particularly desirable in the Western Roman Empire, in Greece and the Italian peninsula. So you had that in addition. Thirdly, this was a major medical center in the ancient world. You remember we've already talked about back several weeks ago when we looked at the city of Pergamum. We said Pergamum had 4 major temples, one to Zeus, one to Dionysius, one to Athena, and one to a god with a little g called Asclepius. Now, do you remember who Asclepius was? He was the Greek god of medicine. And we talked about the fact, the AMA symbol, the American Medical Association, what is it? That staff with a snake wrapped around it, sometimes 2 snakes wrapped around it. That was Asclepius symbol, and it was very, very prominent throughout the city of Laodicea. Now, as we talked about, there was a temple to Asclepius there in Pergamum, but the folks in Laodicea, no, our temple is the real temple to Asclepius. In fact, as one historian said, they claimed that that is where Asclepius resided. What do they mean by that? He lived there. He lived there. And there actually was a medical college and university in Laodicea. And that was particularly known for a product that was worldwide famous at that time. They had an eye salve that was designed to put on people's eyes, and they claimed it cleared, prevented or cured blindness. And literally people from all over the world came and spent massive amounts of money in Laodicea to have their blindness cured. Well, you take all of that together, that was Laodicea. And would it surprise anybody because of their wealth, because of their prominence, because of their religious belief, if you will, that Laodiceans were pretty arrogant people? And in fact, pardon me just a moment, in fact, Laodicea had been granted from the Romans, the Roman government, the Roman Empire. They were what was called an independent city. What do you think that meant? The government, the Roman Empire, pretty well left Laodicea alone. Let them do whatever they wanted to do. They were basically autonomous. Now, why would the Romans do that? I mean, they still had a big, broad parameter of rules and regulations. But why would they leave the Laodiceans alone? Great way to put it. They can see a good thing. And this literally, Laodicea was literally a gem in the crown of the Roman Empire. They didn't want to mess that up. As long as they didn't get out of line, they left them alone. And this is very important, of all the 7 churches, because of the wealth of the city of Laodicea, and because the Romans really didn't get too involved in the politics and the socio-economic life of the Laodiceans, the church, the Christians in Laodicea, were pretty well left alone as well. It was pretty easy to be a Christian in Laodicea. Now, does anybody see why I made that statement at the beginning? Why I see a whole lot of correlation or similarity between churches in the United States of America today and Laodicea? You know, I doubt very seriously that there's any of us sitting here consider ourselves to be rich. But when you start looking worldwide, we are rich beyond belief. And I doubt, as I have said in the past, that any of us felt our life or our freedom or our economic wherewithal would be threatened by being here this morning. Anybody feel that threat this morning? I sure didn't. I never have my whole life. And that's kind of the way it was for these Laodiceans. Now, what's the problem with that? It's a blessing. I'm thankful that none of us are under the persecution that a lot of people in the world are having. But what is the danger of that?
What happens if you get in with this, you don't want to stir the water, if I might say that, and the Christians were, they were more politically correct there than we see here. When you take a stand, and that's true, you form enemies, and they would be attacked. So they would, the water wasn't stirred up. It was calm water, but as long as they get along, whatever they kind of say. So this is what they were doing here. And that's the reason I think that he warned them their situation. They needed hot or warm, cold type of people because of this. Because they wasn't standing strong in the Word of God. At least this is the way I
I think you're 100% right. Opposition tends to build a strong stance. I mean, you look at any group of people in history who've undergone any kind of persecution, they get stronger. They're more resilient. They're more resolved to stand fast. And we've looked at those two churches, Smyrna and Philadelphia, where they were standing strong and fast, and there was no doubt these folks were suffering great persecution. There is no mention in Jesus' remarks to the church at Laodicea that they were facing any kind of persecution, physical, material, even spiritual, because apparently the Laodiceans, they didn't care if you were Christians, because they had lots of gods and goddesses based on the Greeks and the Romans. The city was replete with what we call polytheism. Christianity is just one more religion. So leave it alone. It's not going to bother. And the Christians, as we shall see, as was pointed out so perfectly right here, they got to a point, I just use the word complacency, that they were just kind of drifting along whichever way the wind was blowing, kind of like an old tumbleweed. Whichever way the wind blew, they blew. And Jesus is going to talk about. Now, there's one other thing before we get into the text itself that you've got to understand for this really to make sense, what Jesus is going to say. With all of the advantages and the blessings materially, physically, that the church that the city of Laodicea had, they had one major problem in Laodicea. That major problem was water. There was a massive shortage of water. Laodicea was a huge city. They didn't have enough water. But the Romans stepped in and helped them. They built aqueducts up into the mountains. The mountains, there's a lot of geothermal activity in that part of what is today Turkey. And in fact, earthquakes were very common, and hot springs were very, very common. In fact, in AD 60, during the reign of Nero, the city of Laodicea was leveled by an earthquake. And kind of show you the wealth and the power and the pride and even the arrogance of the Laodiceans. When Rome stepped in and said, we'll help you rebuild the city, he said, we don't want you. They were pretty smart, though, because when you take money from the government, what happens? There are strings, right? And the Laodiceans didn't want the Romans having any more strings, and so they rebuilt the city themselves without any help from the Romans. But up in these mountains, there was lots of water, lots of natural springs. But the problem is, it was hot water. It was hot water. And most of it, I'm guessing here, I haven't read this, I'm guessing that it probably had a lot of mineral content too. But the Romans built these aqueducts, some of which remnants are still alive, are surviving today, down from the mountains, down to the city. Well, that hot water, as it came down those stone aqueducts, down to the city, what do you think that water was like? It had cooled off, but it still hadn't got pleasantly, refreshingly cold like spring water today. It was lukewarm. Now you got to understand that to understand what Jesus was saying to. And I don't know about you, I don't particularly like drinking lukewarm anything. I either want it hot or I want it cold. Well, that water that came down was tepid. It was lukewarm, and probably, like I say, it probably had some bad taste to it too because of the mineral content. So you got to understand it, because Jesus is really going to hit that metaphor hard, and say, this is how you affect me. So let's go ahead. Any questions or comments before we get started into the text itself? Okay, let's begin in verse 14 of chapter 3. Just like he begins to every single one of the 7 churches, to the angel of the church in Laodicea write, the Amen, the faithful, and the true witness. Now obviously, to whom is he referring here? To himself. That's exactly right. And why would he say, hey, I'm the true witness? I have the true, as we'll see in just a moment, the true authority. Why was that important to get across to these Laodiceans? They had so many gods, very good. And even though the imperial cult that we've talked about all along was not that strong in Laodicea, because as we just talked about, the Laodiceans didn't want the emperor to have the prestige that he had in other parts of the Roman Empire. It still had to get across this idea that I am the voice, I am the authority. And then he goes on, and this is kind of controversial. The beginning of the creation of God says this. Now there are a lot of folks who would say the beginning of God's creation, that God created Jesus at the beginning of creation. In fact, you may be familiar with the Jehovah's Witnesses. That's a big stance that they take. But we know that's not true. How do we know that's not true? And we know that's not what Jesus was saying here. Yeah. Remember John, the first chapter, in verse 1? That's 100% right. What's John chapter 1:1 say? In the beginning was the Word with God. Yeah. So we understand the concept of the Trinity. We use that term sometimes. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are one. And have you ever tried to explain that to somebody that didn't understand it? You know, several years ago, I developed this metaphor, if you will, and it always helped me, and it helped, I think, a lot of people I've talked to about it, and maybe it'll help you as well. How many of you like avocados? I'm going to raise both hands, because I really like avocados. But you think about avocado, and if you want to describe an avocado, you got the peeling, you know, that dark purple colored peeling on it. You got the meat, that light green meat, and you got that big old seed stuck in the middle of it. What part of that is avocado? Every bit of it. And when you start trying to decide or describe the holiness of God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, it helps me to think in that term. I had a fellow one time say, that's good, but I would rather talk about the egg because I don't like avocados. Okay, Gary, if you want to talk about the egg, the shell, the egg white, and the yolk, you go right ahead, but I like avocados better than eggs. So, that's what I say. In fact, the word that is used beginning here, the Greek word, now I'm not a Greek scholar, but the Greek scholars say that the word that is used is A-C-H-E-H-E, I believe is how you pronounce it. And that means the origin. The origin of creation, he's saying. The beginning of creation, or the origin, just like we just talked about John, the first chapter, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's what he's saying right here. I am the part of the Godhead. So that's where that authority comes from. And so if you ever get into a discussion with somebody over this 14th verse, that's a good place to go. Verse 15, he says again, like he does to all of the churches, I know your deeds. And just like I've said to each and every one of us, you think the Lord knows what's going on at Saginaw? Absolutely. That's a good way to put it. Do you think he knows all of the positive attributes, the blessings that this congregation has brought upon the city through all those years? He knows it. If there are any discrepancies, if there's any weaknesses, do you think he knows that? He does. He knows. And sometimes I think we just kind of relegate the Lord into the past. We know he's not the past. We know he's the present. We know he's also the future. And that's what he's getting across these folks right here. And then the most well-known portion of this verse, I know your days, you're neither cold nor hot. And I wish that you were cold or hot. Because you are lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I'll spit you out of my mouth. Now again, I'm not a Greek scholar, but the Greek scholars tell me that what he's really saying here, and I'll just calm this down since we all just ate breakfast. He said, you make me sick to my stomach. Whereas they're going to spit you out of my mouth. Now, an exact translation is a little more graphic. You make me sick. You nauseate me. Boy, that's pretty tough language, isn't it? Do you think the Lord is serious about this lukewarm nature? And as we've already talked about, the influence of the city of Laodicea, the wealth, the arrogance, the opulence that it lived in that contributed undoubtedly to this lukewarm nature, as was pointed out a moment ago. Whatever, don't ruffle feathers, don't ripple the waters. It's important to understand, and it's really important to me with the exact translation to see just how the Lord views what we're calling generically complacency. What do you think he means when he says, I would rather you be hot or cold? We understand completely why he wants us to be hot, on fire for the Lord, doing something, making a difference in this. So we understand that, but what about that concept? I'd rather you not be doing anything than that.
Well, kind of if Christians,
No, go ahead.
if Christians are lukewarm, and you see that the world sees that, we're not committed, and so they don't see the commitment, so it doesn't really matter.
Okay, good point. Yes, sir.
I've had it explained to me that Laodicea had the hot springs and the cold springs, and that both are useful. But if they're mixed, it's not very useful. So the idea is to make sure that you're being useful.
Okay, good point. Very, very good. Two good points. Yes, sir.
Oh, I thought someone else was. When I look at this and do this and study about this, as she just said, you're hot, you're on fire. I'm speaking spiritually now.
Right.
You're on fire for Christ. If you're lukewarm, you're going to mislead a lot of people because it's going to be telling the truth sometimes, and distorted truth that appease the ears of the people that are going to hear. If you are cold, you don't know anything about it, so it's not going to mean anything. So this lukewarmness is a great danger.
Good point. I like that concept. It's a great danger. Have you ever been visiting with a non-believer and they bring up somebody, maybe yourself, some other Christian, and something that they were doing, saying, acting, that did not coincide with Jesus' teaching? And you hear words, something to this effect, how about this? You or somebody else claimed to be a Christian, and yet you did this? You said this? What kind of effect does that have upon that person? I like the word, it invalidates everything for which we stand. It invalidates everything that Jesus said, or everything that Jesus required of us, that he requested of us. So the bottom line is, Jesus says very plainly here, I want you obviously to be hot. Remember Matthew 6th chapter, verse 24, I love that passage, where Jesus says, for no man can serve two masters. If you're lukewarm, what are you doing? You're serving two masters. He goes on, he says there in verse 24 of Matthew 6, he'll either love the one and hate the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. And then listen to this. And this ties right into what he's saying to Laodicea. You cannot serve God and mammon. Mammon is a Greek word that literally means what? Wealth. Yeah. Material things. You think that that has any relevance in our society today? Oh man. Oh man. How many times do we see Christians or congregations or maybe ourselves that we get so tied in to this materialistic world that we forget about what we're supposed to be doing? And that seems to be exactly what was going on with the church at Laodicea. Then he goes on. Because you say, verse 17, because you say, I am rich. So they're looking at their physical or material wealth, so everything's okay. You know, I'm not going to be political here, but I think back several presidents ago of a president who, as I used to say, had the morals of a coyote. But he was reelected because people said the economy's good. That's why these folks, as long as they were wealthy, as long as everything was good, as long as the economy was booming, we don't need anything else. And then he goes on and he uses several of these other concepts that we talked about. He said, and have become wealthy and need nothing, and you do not know. Now listen to how Jesus says, here's how you look to me. And I think it's very important that we stop and we ask ourselves individually and ask ourselves as a congregation occasionally, how does the Lord see me? I think we've got to start there. Not how does the Lord see you or you or you. How does the Lord see Greg? How does the Lord see him? And Jesus says to the church at Laodicea, they're sitting here in this comfortable, arrogant position they're in. We look great. We need, as he just said, we don't need anything. And Jesus says, but here's how you look to me. And it does me good every once in a while just to stop and say, okay, how did I look to the Lord this week? How did I look to the Lord today? Which tells me some things I need to do, and Jesus is going to say, here's some things you need to do. To me, Jesus says, you are wretched and miserable and poor, even though earthly treasures you're rich, and blind. Now, based on what we've just said, how would that look for a statement? You're blind, hit the folks in Laodicea. They made a lot of money in Laodicea selling that salve to put on the eyes to prevent blindness. They were worldwide known for that. He says to the church, you don't need to be curing physical blindness. You need to focus on what? Spiritual sight. And as far as I can see, spiritually you're blind. And then he goes on, and naked. Now again, keep in mind when we were describing Laodicea, what was one of the things that they were known for, one of the foundations of their economy? The textile industry. And not just your plain old run-of-the-mill clothing. They had, materially speaking, glorious clothing. The dyes and the black wool and the wool and the mohair, they were known throughout the world for their attire. But Jesus says spiritually, you are unclothed. I advise you, verse 18, I advise you to buy from me gold refined by fire. What in the world does that mean? Gold refined by fire. Your impurity, that's exactly right. How do you refine gold or any other metal? You heat it up and the impurities, particularly with gold, because gold is such a heavy element. Everything that's impure or separate and apart from gold, it floats to the top. And then what do? You skim it all off, and then you got 24 karat gold. You've got gold that's pure and refined. This metaphor Jesus is using, what he's saying? Exactly. Get rid of all the impurities, all the things that are diluting the gold, the precious metal. And that kind of signifies what we just talked about. That's why Christians and congregations tend to thrive under the fire of persecution, because we tend to get rid of all the things that really and truly don't matter. And that's what he's saying here. This is what you need. And you need to get rid of all of this that's going on. Now he goes on, so that you may become rich. Now, how's he talking about rich here? Spiritually. And white garments, what's that? That's the purity that we talked about in the, last week when we were looking at the Church of Philadelphia. And the shame of your nakedness will not be revealed. And look at this, an eye salve to anoint your eyes so that you may see. This is what you need, he says. You need to quit focusing so much on material things and focus on spiritual. You think that might be a lesson that congregations of the Lord's people in 21st century America need? How about us? Oh yeah, definitely we need to focus on that concept. And then verse 19, I'm trying to imagine what it would have been like to have been sitting there when this message is being read to them. Do you think anybody's in stunned disbelief? We've already talked about it. It's very evident they thought everything was great. They thought everything was perfect. They thought everything was wonderful. And Jesus has just lambasted these arrogant, comfortable Christians by saying, y'all need to make some major, major changes. And there are some major, major problems here at Laodicea. What do you think is going through the mind of the folks sitting there listening as the messenger reads this letter? You think anybody's shocked? You think anybody is surprised? You think anybody might be just a little bit angry? And this next verse, Jesus says, here is why I'm being so blunt. Here is why I am saying these hard things to you. He says, those whom I love, I reprove and discipline. Sometimes we misunderstand the word discipline. We correlate discipline with punishment. And there is correlation, there's no doubt about it. But sometimes we make it exclusive. We talk about discipline, we think it means punishment alone. What really, if you're going to define discipline, what is discipline? Correction, good. Learning, very good. Training, direction, we can put any of these synonyms in there. Jesus is saying the concept of reproof means to point out your error. I'm pointing out your error because I'm trying to get you on the right path. I'm trying to wake you up. That's something all those years that I preached. Occasionally, I felt that I was led to speak some pretty tough words. But then I thought, if I'm convicted that we need to make some changes in the congregation and we need to wake up, if I don't say these words, then what am I guilty of? Perfect. That's right. I want to soothe everybody. I don't want, as we've talked about, don't want to ripple the water, don't want to ruffle the feathers. Just want to keep going. Guilty of extending that complacency. And as I've said many times before, it shows a lack of love on my part. Because Jesus, as we know, the reason I'm doing this is because I love you. And I don't want you to be lost. And so I think that would be something. I mean, it's just like all of us who are parents, and most of us don't do near as good a job with grandkids, I know. But if we, in fact, I remember one time my dad and I were sitting there watching a football game, and my nephew, his first grandson, comes walking on, you know, the little grate that goes under the refrigerator that allows the air. Matt comes walking through the living room with the grate over his shoulder. And Dad, he always called my grandson son. Son, what are you doing? Matt looks up, he's about 2. It just fell off, Pawpaw. Dad said, okay. I nearly fall out of my chair. After Matt went on his way, I said, Daddy, if I'd have done that when I was that age, you'd have beat the tar out of me. He said, I know. And that was the end of the conversation. But the reason we discipline our kids and sort of discipline our grandkids, what's the purpose? We enjoy making them unhappy. We enjoy seeing them frown or cry. Why do we do that? Because we love them. We want them to do right. And that's what Jesus is saying here to these Christians. I want you to get back on track because I see where you're headed and I see the danger. So then he goes on, verse 20. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. Where's Jesus knocking? Figuratively speaking. Their heart. Very good. Remember, he talked about the fact in Matthew 7 through 8, he says, if he knocks and we answer that door, he'll enter our hearts. And there's asking will be given to you, seeking you'll find, knocking the door will be open. For everyone that asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and he who knocks, I'm going to come in. The door will be open. And that's what he's saying to him. And I love that. It's not too late. It's not ever too late. Wake up, he says, and follow this. Opens the door. I will come into him and dine with him, and he with me. This is a very prominent theme throughout Revelation, this idea of dining. You know, only the wealthy had these, what we might call banquets or dinner parties, if you want to use a term that's more prominent in our society today. But he says, you know what? You're going to be invited to that great banquet. And we're going to, if you continue through the book of Revelation, you're going to see several banquets, if you will. Who's the only one at the banquet? God's people. Those are the only ones that are going to be invited. And then he goes on, and here's that phrase, every single one of the churches, he who overcomes, or he who conquers. And what do we say that meant all the way through the 7 churches? You persevere. Remember Revelation 2:10, verse, the B part of that verse. Be faithful even unto what? Death. And I will give you a crown of righteousness. And that theme runs from chapter 1 to chapter 22. You be faithful and you hang in there, you're going to receive a wonderful crown, a wonderful reward, a glorious gift from God. I will grant to him to sit down with me on my throne, as I also overcame and sat down with my Father on his throne. Again, a reference to the Godhead. And then he concludes verse 22 like he did with all the other 6 churches. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Which I would say would certainly be indicative of what he desires for these 7 churches 2,000 years ago, 1900 really, more closely, and what he desires for us at Saginaw. And that's why we studied that. That's why we spent 2 months studying these 7 churches. He who has an ear, listen to what he said. For we know in 2 Timothy 3:16, for all Scripture is inspired by God. In verse 17, it's profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness. The man of God may be complete, equipped for every good work. Everything in God's Word is beneficial. And so that's why we studied this, even though, as we pointed out that very first week, a lot of people are scared to death of Revelation, and there's no reason to be. There's no reason to. Glorious, glorious book. I want to thank each and every one of you for being here these 2 months, and I want to thank the elders for giving me the opportunity to bring these 2 months of, or this month of lessons, or 2 months. It's been 2 months, hasn't it? Time flies when you're having fun. Thank you very much. Appreciate y'all.